So this can be a very confusing topic, and I'm kind of not making this video just for you, but also for myself. Understanding how transposing instrument works has certainly been a reason of frustration for many of my students, but I think I came up with the definitive answer to all your problems. Well, not really, but I think this is gonna help, so hear me out. Based on the questions I've been getting throughout the years, I've learned to understand that the origin of this frustration is due to the fact that people don't really understand why transposing instruments have to exist in the first place. So the problem is not really in the mechanics of how transposition works, because changing keys, which is essentially what this is about, is a fairly simple concept to grasp for any musicians I know. So let's start from this. Why are there transposing instruments in the first place? We can assume most composers and musicians would be familiar with guitars, right? Or at least more familiar with them than brass and woodwind instruments, which would be the instruments you would normally put into this category. Yes, guitars do transpose an octave below, but that's not really what I want to talk about right now, so let's pretend they don't for a second. What I want to talk about is this little buddy over here. This is a capo, and what it does is basically shortening the length of a fingerboard. But why on earth would I bring this up? Let's discuss. Guitars are funny, they don't really work like a piano, you know? The language we understand in our twisted little guitar dimension is the one of shapes and tablatures, or tabs as we like to call them. And that is why we can't read for shit. You see, everything you play can be transposed up or down by simply moving the very same fingering on different spots on the fretboard. And by using this device, you can quickly transpose chord progressions to many different keys, but keep the original voicings. How is this relevant though? Well, the chords I played were a G, C, and then a D, but when I used the capo, everything went up a major second, essentially giving me the same progression, but now in the key of A. As a guitarist though, I don't really think in these terms. Do you remember how a few moments ago I said what we understand is shapes? This progression to me still remains a G, C, D because of what I'm physically playing on the instrument. The fact that the key changes to A is of secondary or very little importance to a player for this particular context, because in actuality you play the very same thing you would in the original key without a capo. And this is precisely what happens with more traditional transposing instruments like a B-flat trumpet or a saxophone, except rather than using a capo, of course, you get actual instruments of different physical sizes tuned to different keys. The benefit from this is for a player to be able to switch between different instruments of the same family but still keep the very same fingerings. Obviously, different sizes can lead to higher or lower pitches, like for example in the saxophone family, but they can also offer a slight tonal variation when you get instruments tuned to keys closer to each other, like for example in the case of a C trumpet and a B-flat trumpet. Things only start to become confusing when we talk about notation, but let's try to make it simpler for everybody to understand. I think part of the problem is the intervals we have to deal with when we're using a B-flat trumpet or a French horn in F. So let's go back to guitars for a second, which I think are a little bit easier to understand, because rather than having these weird intervals, it transposes down an octave. In more practical terms, what I just said means that when you read a middle C on the stave, it translates to this C an octave lower. Reversely, if you want to write the very same note I'm playing, so I'm talking about writing, not reading, you would have to transpose it an octave higher than the actual pitch you're producing. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that you could separate the process into two different phases: writing and reading. For instruments that are tuned down, like a guitar, a bass, a B-flat trumpet, or a French horn, the transposition works in such a way that the notes on the stave read lower than the written pitch, but if you want to write them, you write them higher than the actual pitch you're producing. For instruments that are tuned higher than concert pitch, it's exactly the opposite. So you read higher and you write lower. And this is all you have to remember, really, if you can't be bothered to understand the mechanics, and then just apply whatever kind of formula is relevant for the instrument you want to use. For example, in the case of a B-flat trumpet, so tuned a major second lower than concert pitch, a C on the written stave produces a pitch, and it reads a major second lower than the written note, so it's a B-flat. But say you want to hear the note C from a trumpet and write it down on the stave. In that case, you would have to write it a major second higher than the actual pitch you're producing, so as a D. And I think this second step of how a note writes as opposed to how it reads is actually more relevant for composers, because of course from occasion you would read parts, but you know, the job of a composer is writing parts. Nobody talks about the second step really. I never really came across on it in a book. Maybe it's because it's intuitive, the fact that you have to invert the formula, but it's also the part that makes it so incredibly confusing. I seriously hope I did not manage to confuse you any further, but please do let me know if that's the case. Right, so thanks for watching, like, subscribe if you're new, and see you very soon. Bye.